In a time when African Americans were being degraded and denied their rights by society, John Johnson made it his responsibility to honor them by creating Ebony magazine. In the mid 1900s, African Americans were depicted negatively in advertising campaigns, treated unequally than other races, and were not given equal opportunities to enhance their abilities. Ebony magazine helped to empower African Americans with fashion, advertisement, and literature by including content that was directly towards an African American audience. Ebony magazine glorified the African American culture. The magazine company advertised products that were targeted towards and depicted African American consumers, with African Americans on them or mainly for their use, published stories that affected African Americans, and even started a fashion show with African American models. While Ebony was a business and profited from targeting the African American market, it had the additional goals and effects of African Americans taking increased pride in themselves and empowering that company.
John H. Johnson was the creator of Ebony magazine. He was born in 1918 and grew up in Arkansas City. Johnson moved to Chicago after elementary school because his mother believed he would have a better chance of pursuing his academic goals in a bigger city. When he first came to Chicago, he went to DuSable High School and then went to the University of Chicago. Shortly after, Johnson started working at a printing office. His mother supported his career and aspirations, so she loaned him $500 by selling furniture so he could start his first magazine, Negro Digest. With this experience, Johnson created another magazine which his wife Eunice Johnson named Ebony, inspired by the thick sable wood. Johnson created Ebony because there had never been a magazine which captured the black experience. The first Ebony issue was released in 1945. As planned, the magazine resonated throughout the African American community. Although the magazine continued to sell well after the first copy, Johnson needed more money to support the magazine. Johnson began to make connections in the industry to help advertise for Ebony. Over the years, he expanded the company into a great success. Ebony magazine intended to use content that African Americans felt the need to read. Articles that were published consisted of blacks that were in the news for their achievements or hardships. The articles were written by African Americans because Johnson felt the need authors should relate as much as possible to the audience. Some of the literature included issues and stories about the ongoing racism and segregation at the time. A lot of what got published in Ebony were guidelines on African American lifestyles, such as what to wear, listen to, and buy. Editors would use these guidelines to lead African Americans into being respectable citizens. Journalists who wrote for the magazine came from Chicago, since the company was located in Chicago. The literature of the magazine also shone light on African Americans who had something to say by being the outlet. Readers looked to Ebony for inspiration on how to live a positive lifestyle.
In order to have a magazine, you needed to be able to support it, and support it wasn't just having people buy it, it was also having businesses advertising it. And so, he spent almost all of his life that I can remember always selling ads to everybody he could possibly sell them to, because that was how the magazine was supported. But in doing that, he also really helped to create the African American consumer market and to give it recognition so that the general market companies could recognize the value and the spending power of the African American consumer. So that was another reason that, to create such a magazine.
John H. Johnson used his marketing skills to get African Americans in advertisements. Before Ebony magazine, a lot of advertisements were using only whites to promote items. Johnson and other African Americans were angered by this because whites were advertising everyday products such as toothpaste and soap, yet the consumers were both black and white. African Americans believed that more blacks should appear in advertisements. Johnson would not publish any advertisements that did not have blacks in them because he thought that all demographics that purchased the product should be represented. Blacks wouldn't buy certain products depending on the way they were depicted in the advertisements. These protests led to brands like Coca-Cola and Colt 45 promoting their products using blacks because a lot of companies profited off the money of blacks. Ebony also included advertisements for items that were directed toward their black readers, such as hair and skin products. The video.
The Johnson family continued to empower African Americans when Eunice Johnson launched the Ebony Fashion Fair in 1958. Eunice Johnson had a vision and was persistent as she worked year-round searching for the next extravagant pieces to showcase in her shows. Eunice traveled to France and Italy to find the pieces she desired to add to her collection, each time challenging the designers to get past any initial prejudiced judgments, as her fashionable presence, intelligence, and determined demeanor provided enough qualification.
Nicole Bedingfield. And growing up in Chicago, during my time as a young woman, it was just always a dream if you could attend the Ebony Fashion Fair. The Johnson name in Chicago was synonymous with fashion, and I probably attended several over maybe a period of 10 years, and it was just a wonderful experience. In addition to the fashions inside the show, it was also amazing to see the fashions out in the audience, the clothes that the people had on at the fashion show, myself included. I would spend weeks preparing to go, changing outfits, laying outfits out. And by the time I got there, the morning of the show, it was just, okay, whatever, I'm going to see the real fashions that Mrs. Johnson has selected. It was just a wonderful experience, having worked in the cosmetic industry and Fashion Fair being one of the leaders. That was also of great interest to see what the latest styles were going to be. And she was just so innovative in choosing the style of the day. I also appeared in an ad in Ebony magazine, so that was also a thrill for me in my lifetime to actually be on the pages, not as a model, a runway model, but a model in an ad for Johnson Publishing Company. But I am just so sorry that the shows had to end, because I think that young women today need to see what fashion really is. There are fashion designers now that create clothes for people, but she was just amazing in her ability to put together the fabrics and the combinations of clothing. I also think that in addition to it just being a fashion show, it was a way to bring the community together, because you would see people that you hadn't seen, you would meet new people, and you all had one goal in common. And that goal, the first goal, was to support the charity that was putting on the show. And the second goal was to, as I said, to see the latest fashions. But the main goal was to support those charities in the African American community. And as we said before, some of them were in gymnasiums and some were in theaters and auditoriums, but all of them were to support the common goal of raising money for African Americans at that time.
Every day I realize how blessed I really am. And they were incredible parents, great mentors, great teachers. My mother really taught me about culture and about style and about sophistication and a lot about education. She was a real stickler for education, as were both of my parents. And I think my father really taught me about humanity and about being firm but fair with people, and really listening and engaging people. And you know, it was a great privilege. It was a great privilege to be your daughter, and one that I don't take lightly ever.